study of prophecy and fulfilled prophecy. A lot of this comes down to our understanding of the coming of the Son of Man. The majority of our eschatology or our understanding of prophecy in the New Testament is understanding the coming of the Son of Man. And so once we understand the coming of the Son of Man, we're going to be able to understand a lot of the prophecy that we see in what's called the Olivet Discourse. So the Olivet Discourse is the prophecy that Jesus gives when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives after he left the temple. We see the parallel accounts in the Synoptic Gospels. Does anybody know what the Synoptic Gospels are?
I remember.
Yes, you remember?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
And Luke.
Matthew,
Excuse
Mark,
me.
and Luke. So we have the three parallel accounts of the prophecies of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to be looking at all three of those. We did, for the last couple of weeks, we've been kind of going through all three accounts and looking at them parallel. You know, when you have three witness accounts of something, you want to take a look at all three witnesses and see what they say. As we saw last week, there's a little bit of differences in each. There's some areas where Mark tends to be more specific, and there's some areas where Luke tends to be more specific in certain areas. And so that's how it's a good idea to kind of look at all three of those accounts of the same prophecy given by Christ. So that's what we're going to be doing again this week. We're going to be looking at that. We're going to be spending a lot of time in Matthew chapter 24. So that's the big area of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapter 24. The other parallel ones from the Synoptics are Mark 13. So if you guys want to just kind of write those down, Mark 13 and Luke chapter 21.
You want to explain the Olivet Discourse? What's that mean, Nick?
It's when Jesus left the temple. If we looked in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus gives the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees, tells them that judgment's going to be on them, and then he leaves the temple, goes to the Mount of Olives, sits on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples ask him when these things are going to be. And so then he gives the prophecy of the coming of the Son of Man, and there's a lot of things that are involved with that, which is what we're going to be talking about.
What were those scriptures again you mentioned?
So the big one is we're going to be spending a lot of time is in Matthew 24, so you can kind of keep your bookmark there. So we're spending a lot of time there. The other accounts are in Mark 13 and in Luke 21. So last week we kind of just went through the whole thing, looked at the whole prophecy, and then we spent a lot of time in Matthew 24 looking at verses 9 through 14. We really focused on that portion of it last week. The week before that, we spent a focus on the from verse 1 through verses 8. And so this week we're going to be talking a lot about what's called the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation. So we'll be talking a lot about that today. But I just want to kind of recap a little bit, though, for those of you who weren't here. So at the end of Matthew chapter 23, we see some interesting stuff. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is in the temple, and he's given the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees, right? He's given the 7 woes. Now what does the word woe mean? Doesn't mean like woe, stop a horse, right? It means woe means judgment on you. So he gives the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees. And then at the end of it, he gives us what we would call kind of a time indicator. Kind of a time indicator. In verse 36 at the end of Matthew 23, he says, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." All these things will come upon this generation. The Greek word there is genea. It means generation. It means this generation, the generation to which he was speaking. Judgment is coming for them. Then we see a lament over Jerusalem by Christ. And the lament says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it? How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So that's the very ending of Matthew chapter 23. He's in the temple. He's given the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees. The judgment's going to be on them. It's going to be on this generation. And at the very beginning of chapter 24, verse 1, it says Jesus left the temple and was going away. So the context is continuing. We don't really have a new context here. From chapters 21 all the way through 24 and 25, we see that first Jesus is at the temple. He goes to Jerusalem. He's at the temple. He's giving all these woes to the scribes and Pharisees. He's talking in front of huge crowds at the temple and in front of his disciples, and then he leaves the temple. That's essentially our context. It says Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So Jesus is giving a prophecy of the destruction of the temple. That's what he's giving them right off the bat in the beginning of Matthew 24. The destruction of the temple. Verse 3, As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So we talked about this last week. The word that's used here in the Greek is aeonos. It means age. It does not mean world or creation. It means a space of time or a cycle of time. They're asking about the end of the age. Now, if you remember from Matthew chapter 12, Jesus is talking about this age and the age to come. So that's what's on the disciples' mind, this age and the age to come. And so now we see that they're asking about the end of the age. Verse 4, And Jesus answered them, See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. And they will lead many astray, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So verses 9 through 14, we spent a lot of time on last week looking it over. I'm just going to recap real quick on it. Verses 9 through 14 says, Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The end of what? The age. The end of the age. Now, what we did last week is we showed the synoptic gospels and their readings of these verses. If you look in Mark 13 of the same prophecy, Mark 13, this same area of the prophecy starts in verse 9. And Mark is a little more specific in this case. Mark says this, he says, But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. So notice what he says is that they're going to be dragged before councils, right? Beaten in synagogues, standing before governors and kings. And as we showed last week, several areas in the book of Acts, we see them dragged before councils, charged not to teach, right? They're dragged before governors, dragged before the synagogues, they're beaten in the synagogues, they're stoned, they're imprisoned, and some of them are even put to death in the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, we see a fulfillment of this portion of the prophecy where Jesus is warning the disciples that they're going to be delivered up to tribulation. So back to Matthew 24. So we saw in the book of Acts a lot of fulfillment of what Jesus was talking about when he was telling the disciples that they would be delivered up to tribulation and put to death. Several of them were put to death. In the book of Acts, we see the fulfillment of that. But a lot of people ask about verse 14, and we covered this last week. In verse 14 in Matthew 24, it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So we see the fulfillment of that. Paul, in the book of Romans, in his letter to the Romans and his letter to the Colossians, as we talked last week, shows the fulfillment of that. If you wanted to turn to Romans chapter 16, I can just give you an example of that. For those of you who are in our Romans group that we were doing a Bible study on Romans, we talked a lot about areas in Romans that have some eschatology in it. So Romans 16, at the very end of the letter, Paul confirms something very interesting for us. In chapter 16, verse 25, he says, "Now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, but has now been disclosed, and through the prophetic writing has been made known to all nations, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. To the only wise God be glory forevermore through Jesus Christ. Amen." So we see you have a confirmation by Paul to the Romans that that portion of the prophecy had been fulfilled. So it's important to understand the time frame of when these things are happening. Okay? So when the prophecy took place, the prophecy of Olivet Discourse, it happened during Jesus' ministry, right? Which was around about that time frame. 80, 30, 36 is about that time frame is when this prophecy happened. When Paul wrote to the Colossians and wrote to the Romans, we have a time frame of about 30 some years later. So Paul's confirming that the gospel was proclaimed to all the nations about 30 years later. So we have the fulfillment of that verse there. So that's kind of where we're at so far. We've talked a lot about the time indicators. We've been talking a lot about that, what are called the time indicators. Basically, the areas of the gospel where Jesus gives us a time frame of when this is supposed to happen. The time frame of when the Son of Man is supposed to come, right? The coming of the Son of Man. So we talked a lot about that the last couple of weeks. I'm just going to write these down for you. You can see them. You can write them down and look for yourself if you want. Matthew chapter 10. If you want to read that later, we'll give you some context behind that. So Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is calling to his disciples, right? He gathers his disciples, and he's going to send them out among Israel, right? Send them to the towns of Israel. He's going to give them power to heal, to draw out demons, and do all these things. And then he tells them that they are not going to finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. They're not going to finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So that's a time indicator. He's saying this is the time frame that this is going to happen. The Son of Man is going to come in that time frame. We have another one in Matthew 16. Where Jesus tells his disciples, he says that there are some standing here who will not taste death until the Son of Man comes, right? So they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. It's another time indicator. Now, notice that Jesus is not giving the day or the hour, but he is giving a time frame. These things are going to happen within a certain amount of time. Then we see several in Matthew, well, two really in Matthew 24. We talked about one last week. And the one that we talked about last week was the fact that Jesus said that the gospel had to be proclaimed through all the earth, right? The gospel had to be proclaimed to all the world, to be a testimony to all nations, and then the end would come. So that's another time reference. He says this has to happen, and then the end will come. The other one that we see in Matthew 24, the other time indicator that we see, and I want you guys to look at this. It's in the lesson of the fig tree, starting from verse 32. He says, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So we see another time indicator. Jesus is saying, this generation will not pass away. Again, the Greek word, genea, it means generation. It's the generation to which he is speaking. I hear a lot of people that try to say, well, he's talking about the generation that sees these things. That's what he's talking about. The problem with that interpretation is that in every place where we see Jesus saying this generation, he's talking about the generation he's speaking to. He's talking about the immediate audience that he's talking to in every situation. So if we're going to be consistent in our exegesis of the text, if we're going to be consistent, we can see here that he's again talking about the generation he's speaking to. This generation will not pass away until all these things, what things? Everything that he's said up to this point. Everything that he said up to this point. All these things take place. So that's why we're kind of going through this piece by piece. Like I said, last week we were looking at verses 9 through 14, covering that, showing that that has been fulfilled, showing even in the scriptures where those areas have been fulfilled in scripture. And so today we're going to be looking at the abomination of desolation and what that means. So, starting in verse 15 in Matthew 24. Says this, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." So this is the area of the prophecy of the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation is a part of the abomination of desolation. So this is something that we pointed out last week. I want you to notice that Jesus is warning them. He's warning them, and he says, when you see these things, what is he telling them to do? To run, to flee. And he says, pray that your flight won't be in the winter, right? He's telling them to flee. When you see these things, run. Notice what he's not saying here. He's not saying, hey guys, don't worry about it, we're going to pull you off the planet. Right? He's not saying that. He's saying when you see this, you need to run. You need to flee. And this is the prophecy of the Great Tribulation. So we don't see what's called a pre-tribulation rapture here. Okay? We don't see a pre-tribulation rapture of any kind. We see Jesus warning them, telling them that when they see these things, you need to run. So the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. We will look at Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9 here in a minute, but we want to cross-reference with the synoptic gospels, right? So turn to Mark and we'll look at Mark's account of it, Mark 13. Mark 13, starting in verse 14. Says, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. So again, same kind of warning, saying if you're on your housetop, don't go back down to your house. If you're out in the field, don't go back into the city, right? Run when you see these things. Leave. So very similar, almost some areas almost word for word, but there's a little bit of differences, as you can tell. Now let's look at Luke's account, because Luke is going to be a little more specific in areas on this. Luke chapter 21. All right, Luke 21. We're going to be starting in verse 20. He says this. He says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart. And let not those who are out in the country enter it, for these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So this is Luke's account of the abomination of desolation. And what do we see happening here? We see an army surrounding Jerusalem. We see it being destroyed and trampled underfoot. Again, we see the same exact warnings, right?
Isn't he talking about when the Romans took over Jerusalem?
Correct.
Titus.
Correct. So now we have a clearer understanding of what the abomination of desolation involves. What's going to be happening, right? Armies are going to surround Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is essentially going to be destroyed. So here's some of the things in the Olivet Discourse that we're going to kind of just check off here. The prophecy of the Olivet Discourse involves the destruction of the temple, persecution of the disciples, right? The abomination of desolation, or the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, right? So those are the main things that are happening in this prophecy. So if you want to turn back to Matthew 24 again. Matthew 24, this account of the Olivet Discourse is very long and very detailed. It kind of helps to kind of stay there and keep your bookmark there. It really helps. All right. It's the abomination of desolation. So, as we've been pointing out for the last couple of weeks, a lot of this prophecy has been fulfilled. A lot of it has already been fulfilled. Unfortunately, today in modern Christianity, a lot of people like to say that none of this has been fulfilled, right? That this is all in the future. None of this has been fulfilled. The problem is that unbelievers can read the Bible just like we can. And we talked about this last week. Unbelievers can read this just as well as we can. And they can read it in context and see what's being said. The problem is that in modern days, the atheists and the unbelievers, they use the Olivet Discourse to prove, or to try to prove, that Jesus is a false prophet, that Jesus lied, Matter of fact, I just watched a podcast just a few weeks ago with an atheist who was saying that Jesus lied, and guess what he uses? He uses the Olivet Discourse. He uses this prophecy to say that Jesus lied. Why? Because we see all these time indicators. We see all these things where Jesus says it has to happen within this time frame. And if it didn't, then Jesus is a false prophet. But we know that Jesus isn't a false prophet. But the reason atheists think that, or unbelievers think that, is because modern Christians are saying that this didn't happen. This hasn't happened yet. So that makes it puts a lot of confusion on these verses, and it makes Jesus out to be a false prophet or seem like a false prophet. That's a big thing. That's why our eschatology is important. Right? We talked about this. It's important for us to make sure that we're presenting Christ biblically and accurately to unbelievers. And when we don't do that, we make it seem like he's lying. And it's interesting because all of the early church fathers and even some of the reformers, they were using these verses, they were using all of the discourse to prove Jesus is the Messiah, to prove what he was saying was true, because they knew this had already taken place and they had evidence of it. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that evidence today. But real quick, I want to just go over the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 and the prophecy of the abomination of desolation.
I have to look. No, I just have to go down.
That's again, this is what you know what I mean? So because they look at it and say, well, this is in the future where God would have to set himself up. And I mean, just exactly what Nick's saying. So,
All right. Daniel chapter 9. I'm going to give some context real quick. Now, the prophecy here of the abomination of desolation, we could literally spend months going over this. We could spend months studying this, unpacking it. Matter of fact, my Bible's commentary has more than half a page of commentary on this verse.
Yep.
We could literally spend so much time here trying to unpack the calculations of the 70 weeks and so on and so forth. We're just kind of go over the basics here and get kind of a bird's eye view of what this is saying. So some context real quick. Daniel is praying, right? He's praying and he's fasting and he's pleading with God, right? He's begging for forgiveness of the sins of his people and of himself. He's begging God for mercy. That's what's happening here. The context behind this is the Jews are in exile at this point. They're exiled to Babylon. There is no temple standing at this point. Right? It's desolate. The first temple is gone. And there's no temple. Starting in verse 16, says this: O Lord, according to all your righteous acts, let your anger and your wrath turn away from your city Jerusalem, your holy hill. Because for our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and your people have become a byword among all who are around us. Now therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and his pleas for mercy. And for your own sake, O Lord, make your face to shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations, and the city that is called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not, for your own sake, O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name. So as we can see here, we see a little bit of Daniel pleading, begging for mercy. He is confessing sin. Then who comes to him? Gabriel. Gabriel comes to him. Verse 20. It says, while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God, for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. I find this interesting because you see, pretty much through all of chapter 9, Daniel is praying and pleading, begging for mercy. He's fasting. He's doing all these things. And Gabriel says, at the beginning of your plea, a word went out. At the very beginning of your plea, the word went out. Right? That's amazing. I love that. So then we get to the 70 weeks. Verse 24 says this, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. So I want to stop right there. It's about the people and the city, right? Not just the people, but it's about the people and the city. To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So again, there's a lot here we could unpack. We spent a lot of time here. My Bible commentary gives a lot of information of the different ways that these passages have been interpreted over the years. A couple of things I just wanted to make clear of what Gabriel tells Daniel. He tells him approximately when this is going to happen and what's going to be accomplished. Okay? What's going to be accomplished? Put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. So when we look at these things, we can see that Jesus is the only one that can fulfill those things. Right? Jesus is the only one that can do that. And so we have to ask ourselves, did Jesus do that? Did Jesus do those things? We see that he put an end to sin. He atoned for sin, right? The atonement. Jesus is the only one that can bring in everlasting righteousness for us, right? Jesus did all of these things. And so that's kind of what I wanted to point out about this prophecy, is that Jesus is the one that has to fulfill those things. And that at Jesus' advent, when Jesus came and was on the earth, Jesus already did those things. He fulfilled those things. But notice that it says this. It says, and after the 62 weeks, verse 26, and after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. Shall be cut off and have nothing. The anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. That means the anointed one has to die. Cut off in this context means to be put to death. And so the anointed one is Christ. He has to be put to death. He was crucified. He was crucified. and have nothing. And then it says this, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So after the crucifixion, the city's going to be destroyed, basically. So there are some of the main points in Daniel's prophecy about the abominations of desolation. When we looked at Luke 21, we saw exactly what Luke was saying. An army is going to come destroy Jerusalem. It's pretty simple. So if you want to turn back to Matthew 24. Okay, so a little history today. How much time do I got left here?
Can you sum it up in 7 minutes?
Yeah.
All right.
So a little history.
Very little.
Early church fathers, okay? Between, about 2nd century to about the 5th century, early church fathers all believed that this had already been fulfilled at the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, or AD 70. Okay? AD 70. Why is that? Well, the temple was destroyed, the city was destroyed, and anybody that was left was held captive by the Romans. All of that was destroyed. Here's just a list of some of the early church fathers that used these verses to prove that Jesus was the Messiah because it was fulfilled. Clement of Alexandria, he lived between 150 and 215 AD. Eusebius, 263 to 339 AD. Athanasius, 296 to 372 AD. Augustine, 379. Chrysostom, 379. Jerome, 347 to 420 AD. Remigius, 437, 533 AD. So all of these guys in the early church believed this is fulfilled, and they taught that it was fulfilled. As well as the Reformers in 16th and 17th centuries, they believed that it was fulfilled also in 70 AD. Just to give you guys a quote here from Eusebius, one of the early church fathers and a historian. He says this. He says, "The many great sieges which were carried on against the cities of Judea, and the excessive sufferings endured by those that fled to Jerusalem itself, as to a city of a perfect safety, and finally the general course of the whole war, as well as its particular occurrences in detail, and how at last the abomination of desolation proclaimed by the prophets stood in the very temple of God, so celebrated of old, the temple which was now awaiting its total and final destruction by fire. All these things anyone that wishes may find accurately described in the history written by Josephus." So we've talked about Josephus before. Pastor Justin has brought up Josephus and his account. And this is something that both the early church as well as the Reformers talked about. And I have Josephus's works right here.
Oh, hey. Why don't you just start page 1? But just one thing, and I don't know. The idea that this is a future tense is really a more modern church idea than within the last 150 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 150, 160 years,
Right.
you know. So as we look back and through church history, not even just early church history, but church history, that they've looked at this, that this was done, you know, that this aspect in the discourse, in all of the discourse, even a big portion of Revelation as we've gone through,
Right.
that this was fulfilled in that first century.
Right.
And so, and I think that's, I'm not trying to step on Nick's toes here by any means in that, but I think that's kind of what Nick is saying. That, look, we're going to allow the text and history to decide, not the ideas that we're saying. Now, does that take away from Jesus coming back? Absolutely not.
No, yeah.
You know, and I know that's kind of where he's going. So as we see this, our hope is that it will all point us in the right direction as Scripture goes, because a lot of this is different than, I would probably argue, that the majority of people in here have heard or held to.
So Daniel's prophecy was talking about the year 70 AD.
Basically, it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, yes.
Right.
The city. Mm-hmm.
So you're saying there's no great tribulation to come yet?
The Great Tribulation took place here at the destruction.
Because I was taught that modern theology
The-
for 30
the-
years, y'all.
Now, I want you to understand something. That doesn't mean that
So
there's
this
not
is bringing me
tribulation
out.
and there's not stuff to
That
come.
doesn't mean that there's not gonna be
No,
tribulation.
that's not what I
Yeah.
meant,
Yeah.
but I was taught.
Sure, oh, absolutely, all of
The
us,
3.5
all of us were.
years, the 7 years with Jerusalem, the whole
Right.
rapture, I was taught that for 30
Sure.
years. So my son's wigging me out a little
Yeah,
bit
sure.
about this.
Absolutely.
But it's right here, but it's the deep.
But here's the thing, the description of the tribulation that we go back to, that's what Nick is talking about with this. Now, rest assured,
We're gonna go through.
yeah, we're gonna go through some crap,
stuff,
we're gonna go
right.
through some crap that we've never seen.
Right.
We're just saying that that's not the prophetic part of this.
Right.
You know?
And I was always taught we'd be raptured and taken off the planet. Thanks, Nick.
Well, and
See
that,
my son?
and that's still being taught, all over.
Oh, absolutely.
I was showing Nick and Justin, I got 4 or 5 Bibles that have whole
Absolutely.
sections on the rapture.
Absolutely.
You know, and so, I mean, just depends, I guess, on
But
how
I didn't
deep you
know it
wanna
was
go.
only in the last 100, 150 years that this was. a
So it's about
theology.
1850. Yep.
Yeah,
So-
those times.
I just wanted to quote some things from Josephus here, just to kind of give you an idea of some stuff, real quick before we close out.
And who's Josephus?
So, yeah, I want to talk about that real quick. So
It was a wee little,
Josephus,
wait, that was a different one.
Josephus,
Jewish historian.
he was an eyewitness account to the destruction of Jerusalem. He was a Pharisee.
Right.
He was a Jewish Pharisee.
Alright.
Okay. He became a general in the Jewish army in the battle at Galilee. Okay. And so he was a part of the war.
Right.
Okay. So as they were being defeated, Josephus, he hid. He had to hide, and he hid under a bunch of dead bodies.
Yep.
He hid himself under a bunch of dead bodies, but he was discovered. When he was discovered, he was taken and he was kept alive, but he was made a slave by Vespasian, who eventually became one of the Roman emperors. But he was basically taken as a slave, and he was used as an interpreter, and he also was used as a historian. So he was an eyewitness account to all these events in the first century.
Most interestingly, and I think Nick's about to tell you, he wasn't a Jesus follower.
He was not a
He's a
Christian.
Pharisee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's
he
it
wasn't.
right there.
Yeah, he wasn't.
So
Yeah.
even outside of this, we also have Tacitus, who was a Roman historian. Okay? So we have Roman history as well as Jewish history backing all of this up.
Right, right.
So I just wanted to give a couple of quotes here real quick from Josephus on the siege of Jerusalem. So remember, the Romans came, they sieged Jerusalem, okay? Famine was a huge thing. Famine was a big problem because the zealots in Jerusalem wanted to go out and fight the Romans. They wanted to go out and fight the Romans, so the people who were against fighting the Romans, they went around and they burned up all the food. They wanted to force everybody out to fight the Romans, so famine was huge. The people ate dung, and the people eventually resorted to cannibalism.
Right.
Nothing better than a
So-
juicy,
So Josephus gives a very interesting account here of what he
baby
saw.
back ribs.
So this is something that Josephus saw, and he writes down about a woman and her child. He says this: she then attempted a most unnatural thing, and snatching up her son, who was a child, she said, "O thou miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve thee in this war, this famine, and this sedition? As to the war with the Romans, if they preserve our lives, we must be slaves. This famine also will destroy us even before the slavery comes upon us. Yet are these seditious rogues more terrible than both the other. Come on, be thou my food, and be thou a fury to these seditious varlets, and a byword to the world, which is all that is now wanting to complete the calamities of us Jews." As soon as she said this, she slew her son, and then roasted him, and ate one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed.
For later. Yep.
She,
Horrible, horrible, horrific things.
Yep.
I think that's
she
good
made
stuff.
them, she could eat them.
One more thing I wanted to point out here.
Everybody thinks it's crazy till the daughter part.
So after the Romans took over, they burned down the temple. Okay, they burned down the temple. This is what Titus, he was the commander at the time, this is what he did. It says this, and now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and all of the buildings round about it, brought their ensigns, that is their insignias, their symbols, brought their ensigns to the temple, and set them over against the eastern gate. And there they did offer sacrifices to them, and there did they make Titus imperator. So basically they were offering sacrifices in the temple as it was completely destroyed, and basically fulfilling the abomination of desolation.
And most of those.
Such as things as like slaughtering pigs.
Right.
And unclean creatures and mocking God.
Well, human sacrifice as well.
And the human sacrifice.
But we'll keep doing this for the
Thank
next
you,
couple
Nick.
weeks. Yep.
But I
I hear a lot of
Are we
weird.
gonna continue on in Matthew?
They're
Yep.
following the
Next week?
pagans.
Good.